have in here is a risk rating form. This risk rating form is not required, and anything in this personnel records tab is not a requirement from DOT. These are just examples of things that I like to have in mind. I actually do a risk rating on drivers. So I actually base it on years of experience as a professional driver, how old they are. You can actually, and you should, put their age. There is no age discrimination until that driver's like over 59 years old. I'm not sure the exact regulation on that, but I'm pretty sure it's 59 years. So number of violations in the last 3 years, number of accidents, red flag violations. I consider red flag violations to be things like multiple logbook violations, and those are things I'm going to show you later on within the PSP report that you can find. So multiple red flag violations to me are multiple logbook violations. They're things that they are just showing consistently that they're getting these kind of violations that on their PSP report. Number of clean inspections. I actually give them points for clean inspections, just like they would get on your SMS report or on their SMS report. I actually give them points, or take points away basically if they have good clean inspections, because that does take a little bit to get a good clean level 2 or level 1 inspection. No drug and alcohol violations. I point them heavily on drug and alcohol violations, and number of employers. Honestly, I'm not a big fan of job hoppers, so I actually use that against them if they've had multiple employers. So I give them 2 points for every number of employers that they've had. So on here you'll actually see that John Doe, he's a 1, 1, 1, and his total risk is a 17. He's in the best range, 15 to 25, and he's a 17, so he's in the best range. Average, it's still somebody that you can legitimately say, yeah, he's an all right guy. He's got, 26, say he's got 30 points that you've factored in. You might want to write notes down here in this section and say, okay, I recommend this guy. He's still a good driver, but why don't we put him through defensive driver training, or maybe he needs a little bit of training on hours of service or things like that. When you start getting into questionable and high risk, that's where, the DOT is never going to see this, but this is where lawyers do see it. If this driver gets in an accident, 2 years down the road, and he's going to question you on why did you hire this guy. They get you on things like negligent hiring and negligent entrustment. That's where lawyers nail you. And let me tell you, if you get in an accident, you're probably getting sued whether it's the driver's fault or not. That's just a gimme, honestly. So if you have a driver that's in this questionable or high risk range, honestly, a high risk range driver I would not hire. A questionable driver, you should have some serious training that occurred upon hire with this particular driver. Interview questions. Here's some just different interview questions that I have. So that's tab 1. That's what I like to have in tab 1. Plus, whenever, depending on if you are the safety manager and the HR person and the everybody kind of person that you have to deal with everything, I actually, put the W-4 in there. I put all their HR stuff in there just because I'm not a big fan of having multiple folders for one person. I like to keep everything contained. Now, if you are, on the safety manager side, or you're just handling the driver qualification side, then just keep this kind of stuff. Keep reprimand letters in there. If they get a violation roadside and you write them a reprimand letter, keep your reprimand letters in there, things like that. But you can put anything in there. I even have some companies that have all their medical, insurance information in there. They put everything in there because it is limited access, regardless of, what you're doing with them. It is limited access. You are supposed to have all of your driver files in a locked and secure location with limited access to only those who need to see it. So here's driver's data sheet. This is in tab 2. So in the folder that I showed you, that you can get online, you can order them online, you can get them at your local office supply store. This is what I have in tab 2, and this is what I consider to be the driver qualification file. Now, this is the driver qualification file that the DOT or the FMCSR says you should have. So the very first page I have in here is not required. It's called a driver data sheet. It has all their basic information because I like to open up a file and have all the basic information on a driver right there for me to look at. I don't like to have to dig through things to find out, okay, what's his cell phone number, what's his home phone number, where's his birth date, all those things. Has all his basic information. And down here I actually have where the driver, his emergency contact information. If that driver gets in an accident, you know, you don't want to be fumbling around trying to figure out who to call. He's telling you who to call. So I have that on the very front. The very next thing, I always have a note to myself, because the very next page for me is the copy of their medical card, social security card, driver's license front and back. That's the very next page. But then 4 and 5 right here, I actually make a note to say run their MVR and PSP report, because as soon as I get an applicant, those are the first things I do. I make copies of the medical card, all those things, and then I run their MVR and PSP. So I have a note to remind myself to do that right away. Plus, it's a note to remind myself that that's where the copy of the CDL. When you make a copy of the CDL, try to make a good, clean, color copy of both the front and the back, because some states have the endorsements on the back of the driver's license, not on the front. So I make a copy of both the front and the back, and I do it in color, because black and white, as soon as you copy it one time, it starts getting fuzzy and unreadable. So try to make a good, clean copy if you can. And get a copy of their current medical card, not the 16 medical cards they had previously. Get their current medical card that's actually going to be on their MVR. So here's a basic application for drivers. So this application is not the same as an application that you would use to hire a non-CDL driver. You're going to ask specific questions for this for CDL drivers. You're going to ask them about all the things that everybody says you can't ask about. You're going to ask him, did he have drug and alcohol issues at a previous employer? You're going to ask him if he had any accidents or crashes, things like that. And you are allowed to ask those, and you are supposed to ask those. So the application for CDL drivers is going to be different than a regular application for non-CDL drivers. So it's basically a 5-page application, an employment history. With the employment history, you need to have a full 10-year history. The driver needs to give you full 10 years of what he was doing for the last 10 years, and you need to verify the last 3 years of that if he was a CDL driver. So John Doe, he worked for ABC Company from 2008 to 2013, and he actually did, he's telling you right here, he was employed with a safety-sensitive position, and he was subject to drug and alcohol testing, and he was subject to federal motor carrier regulations. He's telling you right there whether you need to verify this employer and do your previous employment check with that employer. Now, if we scroll down a little bit, his next employer, 123 Inc., he was employed from 2003 to 2008. He was also subject to employment here. Now, right here, next I'd put NA, only need 10 years of employment, and we have the full 10 years right here. But say he was a driver for ABC and a non-driver, say what if he put no right here? You actually wouldn't have to send a pre-employment notification, a previous employer notification to this employer, because he wasn't subject to any of these regulations. And then he would go on and actually list the other employers that he had. But you do have to have a full 10-year history. And the driver says, well, I was unemployed, or I was incarcerated, or whatever he was doing. It doesn't matter. Anything, if there's more than a 2-month gap, he needs to explain what he's doing. So if he was unemployed, the next and previous employer would be unemployed and the dates that he was unemployed. If he was incarcerated, he needs to put incarcerated. Whatever the case may be, if there's more than a 2-month gap, he needs to explain what he was doing. I actually have 2 pages on the previous employer, because, job hoppers. If they've had more than, 10 employers, you still have to list them. If they've had 16 employers in the last 10 years, they need to list them all. That's just the way it is with federal motor carrier regulations. Okay, here's the questions that a lot of people think you're not allowed to ask, but you do have to ask. Have you ever failed a DOT drug and alcohol test? Have you ever refused? This is about their drug and alcohol testing statement. This is saying, this is the driver telling you, yes or no, I have or have not failed. These should all be marked no. Just FYI, they should all be marked no. If any of these are marked yes, you need to do some checking, because at that point, you need to find out if it's in the last 5 years did they go through a SAP program? Did they complete the SAT program? Are they still in the SAT program? And that's a whole other workshop right there, or a whole other session. But basically, if they've ever flunked or refused a drug or alcohol test for DOT, or for that matter, gotten a DUI or DWI in a personal motor vehicle, they actually need to tell you, and they need to have gone through some kind of a SAP program or substance abuse program, and be able to prove it. You need to have documentation before you can hire him. Otherwise, you cannot hire him or her. They need to tell you if they've had any accidents in the last 3 years, whether it was a personal vehicle or not. They need to tell you. Traffic convictions, same thing. They need to tell you if they've had any issues, say they got a speeding ticket in their personal vehicle. They need to list that there on the traffic violations. It asks, have you ever been denied a license or permit? Have you ever license ever been suspended or revoked? Have you ever been disqualified? They need to answer these questions, and if at any time you ever see yes that they have, you need to have them explain what the circumstances were. Driving experience, they need to tell you what they've been driving. You might be offering them a position to drive a 53-foot reefer trailer over the road, and the only thing they've ever driven was a dump truck, and now they just upgraded to a Class A CDL, and maybe they drove a dump truck with a gooseneck on it. Just because they have a certain license that you're looking for doesn't mean they know how to drive your equipment. So pay attention to the driving experience and what they know how to drive. And I'm going to go into that a little more with the road tests, but do pay attention to that driving experience. Any special courses or training that helps you as a driver, all this basic stuff. Whenever you're looking at an application, you should be looking at the application, not just taking it, filing it away, and saying, okay, I did my due diligence here. You need to pay attention to what all of these things say, because again, I try to help you with not only the DOT side. Honestly, the DOT is easy. If you have all your forms in there and you have everything done right and you have substance behind your policies and your operation, then you're going to be fine with the DOT. Who I worry about is the attorneys. When you get in a crash, they will nitpick every single thing that you have. And the application and your driver's file is the biggest thing they're going to nitpick. So make sure you're paying attention to this. It's actually really important. And a lot of people say, well, we've never been in a crash. And let me tell you, if you're in business long enough with a commercial motor vehicle, at some point you will have a crash. And you will, in 99.9% of the cases, most likely be sued. So whether it's their fault or not. Applicant statement, they're saying that they understand all of these things, that they're filling out this application, you're going to use it, you're going to check the records, all those things. Driver notification and rebuttal. You only have to use this if they dispute something you found with a previous employer. So say you actually checked a previous employer record, and the previous employer comes back and they say, well, we fired this guy for flunking a drug test. And I actually just had this happen last week. I always verify any erroneous information that a previous employer sends me. I always call them and verify that they actually got it right. And last week I had that a previous employer, and we process driver files for our clients. So I do this for all my clients. But so I called, and on the previous employer application or verification, they actually responded that he had failed an alcohol test. So before I disqualify the driver and say, no, you're not, because that's the company policy that I was working with, that they won't hire anybody that's had any issues in the last 5 years, and they actually go up to 10. I called the previous employer and I asked him, hey, you sent me back this verification. I just want to make sure that this is accurate. And the lady I was talking to, she said, no, he's never actually failed an alcohol test. And I said, well, on this previous employment form, you actually put that he did fail an alcohol test. And she said, no, I must have checked the wrong box. Don't use that. He did not fail an alcohol test. So, but in some cases I do call and they say, yeah, he actually did fail an alcohol test and yada, yada, yada. So, but then the driver comes back and says, well, they're lying. They just don't like me. We have issues. This is the case where the driver has the right to dispute something that a previous employer says. So you're going to use this form, and you're going to kind of stay within these guidelines. The actual guidelines are spelled out in 391.23 of the FMCSRs. So make sure that if you do have an employer do that, they do have the right to dispute things, and it kind of goes over in this form of how to do it. But it's not required to be in there unless a driver disputes something. Okay, here's a previous employer form that we use. So we use a one-page format. There is a two-page format. Like I said, if you have two different departments, you have your HR department and then you have your safety department, and maybe your HR department is your DER. They're the person who can receive drug and alcohol information, but you can't. You might use the two forms. This particular form that we have right here is the one-page form, and that's for the safety person who does the drug and alcohol history as well as the safety performance history. Or you could just have your HR department add you as a DER, an additional DER, so that you are allowed to view this. But it all depends on your company policy and how you have it set up. But here's a sample of the one-page form. So John Doe is authorizing you, your company, or us to request this information from the previous employer. In most cases, the driver doesn't know the company's address and fax number and all those things. In a lot of cases, they only know that he worked for ABC Company in Odessa. So we actually will have to Google ABC Company and try to find a phone number and a fax number. And a lot of times it's very tedious because we have to go through multiple searches trying to figure out who this company really is, because they'll take ABC Company when really ABC Company is Appleberry Charlie Company. And that's how it's spelled out in Google, so they don't recognize it. But so do check and do these employment checks very thoroughly. You're going to have to check the safety performance history, all those things, again, that HIPAA says you can't do. With CDL drivers, you have to do, and you have to ask these questions, and these previous employers are required to respond to you. And at the very top of the form, you're actually telling the previous employer, according to the regulations set forth in 382.413, we are required to ask you this information and you are required to give it. So if they want to look it up, they can. So you're asking them about their safety performance history. Were they safe and efficient? Did they have any accidents? Did they drive a commercial motor vehicle for you? What was the reason they left? Are they eligible for rehire? Alcohol and drug history, you're going to ask, did they ever flunk an alcohol test? Did they ever have a positive or adulterated test? Drug and alcohol information that normal companies typically can't ask about a previous employer, but as a CDL driver, they do have to authorize you to request this information. Okay, your company must make 3 attempts within 30 days of hire to contact previous employers for the last 3 years of applicant's job history. Now, if you look in the actual regulations, it doesn't say 30 days, within 30 days. It actually says, and I swear I thought I saw in one of the really, really old FMCSRs that it did say 30 days, but we actually just looked recently and I can't find it. It does say a reasonable amount of time. So you have to decide for your company what is a reasonable amount of time. My reasonable amount of time is within 30 days. Some companies have it within 15 days of employment. You have to get or make an attempt to get the previous employment history within 15 to 30 days of employment. That is a reasonable amount of time, and you have to make 3 attempts to get this. Now, not all companies are going to respond, and it drives me crazy, but they don't. They don't always respond. So you have to note that you've made the attempts. Attempt 1 on this date, attempt 2, attempt 3. Now you can make this bigger and you can put actual notes. You can save fax confirmations or email confirmations or however you want to do it, but you can actually make phone calls. You can get this information over the phone, and a lot of companies will still give it to you, but there's a lot of companies who require this document before they'll release any information. But there's still some companies out there that you can actually call and get most of this information over the phone. It's just that different companies have different procedures and policies. So just make sure you're doing this. The DOT or the FMCSA will verify this, and you will get heavily fined if you are not doing these previous employment checks. And they do verify that you have a full 10-year history. They do verify that you're checking the last 3 years, and I've seen companies get huge fines for not doing this. Fair Credit Reporting Act. This is basically telling the driver that you are using their PSP and their MVR and their previous employment histories to decide whether you're going to hire them. If you do not hire them, then this Fair Credit Reporting Act says that say you don't hire them because their MVR has too many speeding tickets on them. They actually can come back to you and say, can you give me a copy of that MVR? You're required to give them a copy of whatever you used against them, so that they have that, so that they can then dispute something a previous employer says. You do have to answer to them why you did not hire them, if it was because of something on a previous employment check or their driving record. And if they do ask for a copy of their MVR that you used against them, you have to give it to them. So this is basically just telling the driver that. Okay, next thing, certificate of compliance. This basically says that the driver can only have one license. You can't have a license in Texas and have a license in Colorado and have a license in Montana. And believe me, I actually have all my licenses from all the different states I've lived in. I actually have the copies of them, and they clip off the side or punch a hole in it or something like that. But this is saying to the driver that he's only going to use one license. He only has one valid license in one state. And this is a requirement to have. And I have the driver sign off on it saying that he understands he cannot have any licenses in any other state than the one he's using and giving you. Next one, driver certification of other compensated work. Okay, so the other compensated work. Now, some of these forms, if you look in 395.2, paragraph 8 and 9 of the FMCSRs, you're going to see a lot of things in there. Like I said earlier, in the driver qualification file, there's 9 different forms, right? Or 7 different forms, whatever it may be. But there's a lot of things all throughout that FMCSR book that says, and a note of, and a note about, and this, and that, where it's not necessarily a form, but it is a regulation saying 395.2, 8, and 9. It's actually going to say you have to have a note of, or the driver has to tell you, are they currently working for another employer? Do they intend to work for another employer? Because say they work part-time somewhere else. Say they work at a fast food restaurant part-time, and then they come and drive for you only 4 days a week. You actually have to take the hours that they worked anywhere else and take that off of the hours that they're allowed to work for you. Any compensated work. Now, any compensated work can be any kind of work, and this is where lawyers really nail companies. Say they go out and they sell, say they go out and they mow lawns on the weekends, and they just mow lawns around their neighborhood. They get paid $40 or whatever. Technically, that's working. That's compensated work, and they should be taking those hours that they're mowing those lawns and taking them off the hours that they're allowed to work for you. So typically, I like to see that no, they're not going to work for another employer, and no, I don't intend to work for another employer. And I always let the drivers know, if at any time you get any other paid compensated employment, you need to let us know. Because that little extra side money that you don't really know about will definitely hurt you if there's a crash. So they sign a document saying that they do not intend to have any other compensated work, or that you do know about it so you can deduct it. Previous 7 days, hours of duty statement. Basically, they're filling out a logbook for the 7 days prior to that they filled out the application. This is a requirement that you have to have this previous 7 days, whether it's a copy of their logbooks or whatever you want to use. I'd like a form because it's cleaner and it looks cleaner in here. So you do have to have this statement saying that what he did for the previous 7 days prior to filling out this application. Okay, so that's everything, honestly, in tab 2. That's the driver qualification file. So whenever an attorney, say John Doe does get in a crash, and an attorney actually asks you for a driver qualification file, this is all I'm giving him. I'm not giving him my full driver's file. I'm giving him the driver qualification file, and that is it. But I have in my driver's file, I'm giving them whatever they subpoenaed, honestly. I'm not, if they only ask for the driver qualification file, that's what I'm going to give them. I'm going to give them tab 2. Here's another thing. The I-9 form does not have to be in the driver qualification file, but if you are the HR and the payroll and the everybody person, I keep an I-9 in here, but you don't necessarily have to keep the I-9 in here. Tab 3. Tab 3 is where I keep their MVRs, where I keep everything. just because these are things I'm going to access on a regular basis. Tab 2, once it's done, I'm not going to access that very often other than to make a new copy of their CDL and medical card as they expire. But tab 3, I'm in twice a year, sometimes 4 times a year, quarterly, depending on how often my companies want me to run the MVRs. So right here, tab 3 is the anything to do with their driving history. So notice of violations and annual review. Upon hire, he needs to fill out this form, notice of violations and annual review. He needs to tell you, he's already done it on his application, but every year you're going to have to fill out this form. Every single year, at least once a year, and make sure that if he did it on March 3rd last year, you do it before March 3rd this year. It has to be done before 365 days is up. So we actually do them for most of our clients twice a year. We do them in January and again in June. So even if that guy was hired in July, we'll actually run his MVR in July because that's the pre-employment MVR, and then we run it in January, and then we run it again in June. So we're always ahead on this. We never have to worry about not meeting the requirements, but if you just run them once a year, make sure you use this particular form or something like it. You can usually find a lot of forms. You honestly can get a lot of forms for free from the FMCSA. But there's a lot of forms that I make in here that are custom that you can't get from FMCSA because in their mind the only form you need are the 9 forms that they say need to be in driver qualification files. So those typically are the ones you can get for free. And this is one of them. The notice of violations and annual review. So every time he gets a violation, whether it is in his personal vehicle or a company vehicle, they're supposed to come in and actually put on this form. So you're going to use this form throughout the year, and every time he gets a violation, he's going to come in and he's going to put the offense, the location, all this stuff. Or if he just calls you and says, hey, I got a speeding ticket in my car, you can fill this part out. But at the end of the year, he actually signs off on this saying, yes, all this information is correct. Yes, I did get those speeding tickets. I'm signing off on it, and he signs off on it on this date. Then, once he is signed off, because this is basically the release for you to run his MVR, once he signs off, then you run the MVR, and then you do this portion of it. This is where you're actually going to put, does the driver still meet the minimum requirements for safe driving? Now, minimum requirements in 391.11 are what the DOT considers minimum requirements. Your company policy may be stricter. So you need to go with whatever is stricter. If your company policy is stricter, you need to go with that. If the DOT is stricter, you need to go with whichever is stricter is what you need to go with, honestly. At the very minimum, you should be following FMCSR regulations. At the very minimum, those are minimum requirements. That doesn't mean you can't go above and beyond. So if your company says you're not allowed to drive with more than 3 speeding tickets, then at that point, even though he's a current driver, you're going to say, you know what, you've actually had 3 speeding tickets in the last 3 years. You're no longer eligible to drive for our company. And you have to make that decision based on your company policy and based on the things that this driver has agreed to whenever he got hired. Same with, has the driver's accident record been reviewed? Traffic violations been reviewed? You need to fill this out. I have seen fines where they actually said, well, you didn't review it, so we're not going to say that, we're going to say you didn't do it. It's incomplete at that point, and you can get violations for that during an audit. So make sure you're doing that. Minimum is annually, once a year, but I like to do them twice a year. Request for driving record. You may or may not have to do this depending on the agreement you have with whoever you pull your driving records from. I actually like to have the initial one for this driver applicant release to run their MVR the initial time, and then you use the annual review each year or each time you run the MVR. I have seen cases where drivers, because they did not sign off on the annual review page before you ran the MVR, and then you termed, and then he was termed, the driver actually did win an unemployment lawsuit, and because they actually he did not release that information. He did not approve for that information to be released before they ran it. So make sure you're doing that form before you actually run the MVR. Or have one form that says that you're going to run it every 6 months or every year, and it can be used against them. Have them sign one form. So here's a sample of a and I'm not sure how to rotate this for you to look at properly, but here's a sample of an MVR. So this driver, sorry we're going to do it sideways, but this driver has a commercial, make sure it says commercial, Class A, and that it's clear. He doesn't have any history though, you can't see any history on here. And pretty much his MVR is clear, there's no records. So you're thinking, oh, this guy's great, he has no speeding tickets, no nothing, he's doing a great job. But then we go down and he signed a release for you to run a PSP. And I love the PSP. Okay, I love the PSP program. I love all the information that it gives, and it tells a lot about a driver whenever you do this. So make sure that you actually, if you're going to run the PSP, make sure that the driver is actually signing off on this document. You can get this document. It's right from the FMCSA. You go to the Federal Motor Carrier. If you Google FMCSA PSP program, one of the first things that pops up is information about that program. It's super cheap. It's like $100 a year and $10 per report. It's totally worth the money. And just a tip here, if you are running the PSPs, it doesn't save. Like after 30 days, they disappear. So save it to something once you view it on, because they won't save automatically in the PSP program system. So save it to your computer or to your server or wherever you save your documents for your drivers, because they will disappear. And print a copy and have it in their file. So make sure they sign off on that. But here is actually a sample. Here's a sample PSP. And let me try to rotate this for you. Let's see if I do this the right way. Okay. So we're going to rotate this because I really want to show you what this looks like. So I blocked everything out, and I'm going to scroll up so you actually don't see that part. But this particular driver has had one crash. You need to really question if they've had any crashes here, okay? Whether they've had any crashes, driver inspections, out of service rate is 12%. But at the very end, you see log violations, general form and manner, but at the very end, you actually see a summary of everything he did. But this is actually each violation he's gotten in the last 3 years. But there, at the very end, there's a summary. And here's a summary. Excessive weights, axle positioning, frame cracked loose, speeding, false report of driver record duty status, no log violations for general form and manner. So this is what this tells me about a driver. This particular driver, it tells me that he has an issue probably with inspecting his vehicle. If he's getting frame cracked or loose and broken, accessories improperly attached, if they're getting multiple things for the vehicle issues, especially in the same vehicle, but obviously they're not doing their pre- and post-trip inspections the way they should be doing them. But I really pay attention to this. False reporting of that's to me a red flag. And log violations, if they get multiple log violations, to me that is a red flag, because I want these drivers, what they've done in the past is going to predict what they're going to do in the future. If they can't do logs for their previous employers, why do you think they're going to do them for you? If they're not doing their pre- and post-trip inspections for a previous employer, why do you think they're going to do them for you? They're not going to do them for you. So pay attention to this, and this is why I really love the PSP, because it does tell you the personality of a driver.